Hello. There are some years in the history of Warhammer and Games Workshop where a single product launch, a single story, a single event changed history forever. That there was a moment before and a moment after whatever happened. This is not a video about one of those years. Instead, this is a year that was primarily concerned with consolidation, experimentation, and exploring what would become the most important product range in Games Workshop's life. That is not to say that this isn't an important year. Far from it, in fact. Everything that happened throughout this year that we're going to talk about today was incredibly important, that built the foundational steps on which everything else that Games Workshop would do for the next 40 years was actually built. It is hard to overstate just how important this year would turn out to be, because of the things that were explored and experimented with that have had just impossibly long legacies, and they are incredible. So, without further ado, we're going to get into it. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're exploring the year in Warhammer, 1984. This is the Year in Warhammer, my regular series where I look at just a single year in the history of Games Workshop to find out just how influential it was in creating the Warhammer that we know and love today. This time, we're exploring a year that is dear to my heart, because not only is this the first year that the Warhammer world truly emerged, it's also the heralding of a brand new era, one in which I was alive, because it was in 1984 that little Jordan Sorcery fell from the stars or rolled down the mountain or was born from an egg. And, I think that was pretty cool. I'm glad that happened. So I think this is already an influential year, certainly in my hobby life. But we're going to explore just how influential 1984 was for Warhammer and Games Workshop as well. 1984 was a heady year in pop culture. Prince, Madonna, Frankie Goes to Hollywood all had UK number ones. People didn't know it was Christmas, and Stevie Wonder kept calling for some reason. At the movies, Dune was stirring up discussion. Supergirl was on the big screen, and there were chuds everywhere. How times change, eh? Perhaps of more note were the debuts of Ghostbusters, who would later get a Games Workshop RPG reprint. The Search for Spock, who could already be found in the Citadel Miniatures range, and the Terminator, who later got an entire 40k army for himself. But enough about movies, how about we start with the bread and butter that Games Workshop was popular for before Citadel took it over from within, the board games. Games Workshop co-founder Sir Ian Livingstone had decided a year earlier to make a vehicular combat game, somewhat similar to those of friendly rival Steve Jackson Games in the US. So he and Gary Chalk came up with Battlecars, a game that looks significantly more complicated than it actually is. To add to that game, a new two-wheeled expansion was released in 84, with the unexpected title of Battle Bikes. There was also a 1984 attempt to bring Battlecars to video games, and it was not the only Games Workshop 48K Spectrum release in the year either. There was also D-Day and Tower of Despair. Now, I've not actually played any of these games myself, but I have seen that the Internet Archive's emulator actually still runs games like Tower of Despair, so I'm quite tempted to give it a go. Games Workshop's early growth had owed an awful lot to their exclusive license to import Dungeons & Dragons into Europe and the UK. Once they'd lost that, it would change their business considerably, but that wouldn't stop them wanting to find ways to support and exploit the D&D popularity that they were seeing in the marketplace. They had a few ideas of their own. In 84, they launched the first of a planned new series of Dungeon Planner expansions. Only 2 sets were ultimately released in the series, the first being Caverns of the Dead. Designed by Albi Fiore with ace cover art by Gary Chalk, this box set out the stall for the Dungeon Planner offering. An amazing map, some interesting ideas, and that was largely it. The intention was that Dungeon Masters could take the geographical areas described in the box, in a region called Eastern Kos, and make of it what they will. It was was not a full module by design. It was a starter set that you could build your own module with. The second in the series, Nightmare in Blackmarsh, followed that same pattern, expanding the region of Kos. It was again designed by Fiore and featured art by Robert Neville, who had also done the interior work for that first set. The dungeon planners received a mixed reception. Some folks just weren't convinced that leaving so much work to the DM was really value for money. I can only assume that they didn't sell particularly well either, given that they didn't make any more after these two. The dungeon planners were also designed to be compatible with Games Workshop's long-running series of dungeon floor plans supplements. Essentially boxes of card tiles that fantasy game masters could use to build maps of dungeons. The first set had actually been released in 1979, and in 84, the fourth and final set in that first generation of tiles was released. They would, though, be revisited for future releases alongside Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in a couple of years. Even though it was the biggest RPG in the market, D&D was far from the only one. And during this period, Games Workshop got into a bit of a rhythm, licensing third-party games from other role-playing game manufacturers and publishing their own editions of them. The Star Trek role-playing game from FASA was republished in Games Workshop's then-standard bookshelf game box, and it was released not too long after Star Trek III: The Search for Spock hit cinemas. It would stick around for a couple of years before finally being teleported away back to FASA's arms. Elsewhere, Chaosium's unstoppable, unknowable Call of Cthulhu 2nd Edition also received a box Games Workshop version in 1984. There was plenty more support for the Call of Cthulhu game over the next few years from GW's design team as well, with dedicated supplements being produced, as well as an ill-fated attempt from Citadel to secure the license to create official Call of Cthulhu miniatures too. There was also a healthy market in superhero RPGs during this time. There would be a TSR RPG all about Marvel superheroes, also published in 1984, and Games Workshop wanted to get in on the four-colour action themselves. Designed by Simon Burley and Peter Haynes, Golden Heroes was a game of comic book-style superheroic action. First released in 1981 as a self-published amateur zine, the Games Workshop edition of the game was polished and refined to be released as a boxed set. 2 adventures, Legacy of Eagles and Queen Victoria and the Holy Grail, would follow, along with a supervisor's kit for GMs. There was also a range of Citadel Miniatures produced as well, with boxes for superheroes and supervillains. The game received a mixed reception at the time, but it has since built up something of a cult reputation, with many people commenting on its fun and enjoyable gaming style. Citadel was still just one small part of the wider Games Workshop machine in 1984, but this would be a pivotal year for the miniatures manufacturer. With the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle having been published the previous year, much of 1984 was spent expanding the Citadel range to support this fantastic fantasy game. Citadel published irregular catalogues and zines during this period, such as the wonderful Second Citadel Compendium. That was absolutely chock full of Tony Ackland illustrations of the many Citadel miniatures that were available to buy at the time. It can actually be pretty difficult to pin down the precise dates that Citadel products were released during this era, so a lot of the retrospective view comes from checking out the advertising flyers that were published through the years. Fortunately, the incredible Stuff of Legends website has built an excellent archive of flyers, so we can see at least some of the miniatures and releases that were being advertised in 1984. There were ranges of Knights of Chaos and Thieves, Dark Elves, Slann, and Halflings. Trish Carden's iconic Chaos Beastmen, licensed ranges for Dungeons and Dragons, RuneQuest monsters, and the gamebook's Lone Wolf. There was a box set of personalities made famous by White Dwarf as well. During 84, the Oriental Heroes box set was released by Citadel. This was a project by sculptor Ali Morrison that saw him create classic samurai and ninja models. It was partly this range that would inspire the creation of Nippon and Cathay in the background for the Warhammer world to come. The first proper supplement for Warhammer was released in the form of Forces of Fantasy, another box set that featured 3 booklets, It expanded the rules for the game and introduced some world building into the still relatively loose fantasy of the game setting. It also consolidated some of the rules that had been featured on flyers and box inserts. There was also a broader bestiary of fighting forces to play with, and notably, it was the first core rules product to introduce the iconic forces of chaos into Warhammer. Although chaos had appeared in flyers and scenarios, and been talked about in the forthcoming Realm of Chaos supplement, it was with forces of fantasy that the lodestone was laid on which the franchise-spanning armies of chaos could later be constructed. And there would be other examples of the pre-Warhammer world lore that was beginning to take shape. It was often found alongside a brand new series of miniature releases, the Regiments of Renown. Each Regiment of Renown set included a number of troopers, as well as a command group of musician, standard bearer, and champion, though you didn't always get one of each in the box. They were all named units, with histories and litanies of great or terrible deeds to their name. The first of these regiments released was also one of the longest surviving in Warhammer's history, Joseph Bugman's Dwarf Rangers. In the first series of regiments, there were a total of 12 different sets, with some long-standing characters counted amongst them. Grom's Goblin Guard, Mengel Manhide's Dark Elf Company, and Goldfag's Mercenary Ogres all debuted in 1984's Regiments of Renown. With each set came a little more background, published on flyers and in White Dwarf, expanding the universe of Warhammer Fantasy fluff that was gathering like lint in a filter, waiting to be knitted together into something absolutely magical, if that's not a complete nonsense metaphor. Factions and historical events, wars and locations, characters and their enmities, these were the foundations of the world that was really going to start forming with the second edition of the game. With all of the incredible new miniatures that had been released by the end of 1984, it should be no surprise that Warhammer and Citadel had only gone from strength to strength over the course of the year. Testament to that success was the fact that rather than do a second print run of Warhammer Fantasy Battle's first edition, Brian Ansell immediately set designers Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley to work on a brand new version of the game. And this is where that trickiness about pinning down Citadel release dates comes back into play. Technically, this fine fellow and I are the same age. Warhammer 2nd Edition's release was advertised in White Dwarf number 61 in January 1985, and the revised edition of the game had received no mention at all in December 84's issue. However, in the Citadel mail order flyer that was printed in that same December, Warhammer 2 was made available to order. So, whilst I don't know for certain that you could actually receive and play it in 1984, we do know that you could order Warhammer 2 from December that year. And what would you get for your money? A boxed set stuffed with 3 amazing rulebooks full of updated rules. A scenario called The Magnificent Sven that featured Slann and dwarfs. Token sheets full of characters that you could cut out and fight your battles with. And, of course, the first fully fledged version of Warhammer's known world. This second edition was a fully revised version of the game that not only cleaned up the typos of the first, but also polished the presentation to an incredibly high standard. And whilst it still wasn't perfect, it was taking things in such an incredible direction that it was even more popular than that first edition. The new box featured another classic cover by John Blanche, and the 3 rulebooks have some simply gorgeous artwork on and within them. And Warhammer's known world and its history was starting to take shape, and this was a version of the game that you could play and set in Warhammer, an absolutely incredible moment in the history of the game. I talk a lot more about the development and release of Warhammer 2nd Edition in my Making of Warhammer series that you can watch right here. And if you want to find out even more, maybe we'll do an episode about 1985 and all of the fun stuff that came with that in the near future. The year in Warhammer 1984 was truly a pivotal one. It was during this year that Citadel started to really understand the incredible property that they had on their hands. Citadel Miniatures, at Brian Ansell's behest, were being produced at an incredible pace and with incredible consistency. The world of Warhammer was taking shape, allowing advantage to be taken of all of these new awesome minis. The second edition of Warhammer would take the game, Citadel Miniatures, and Games Workshop to some incredible new heights, and set the stage for the company and the games that would come after it. I didn't talk all that much about the consistently brilliant White Dwarfs that were published throughout 1984, but I am going to remedy that just a little bit on my birthday livestream on Sunday, August 3rd, where I'm going to be looking through some of the White Dwarfs from around the time that I was born to see all of the cooler stuff that was going on in RPGs and tabletop hobbies. And if you have a suggestion for a year that I should cover in a future episode of the Year in Warhammer, please do let me know down in the comments. Some people have already voted for 1993, an incredible year that I am very much looking forward to covering. So if you want to second those votes or suggest an alternative year, please do so, because I would love to know what you're most interested in hearing about. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. So, Warhammer made it through 1984 without the emergence of doublethink, thought police, or dystopian geopolitics. And don't want to leave this one on a downer. Quickly, Martha.